Let's be honest about the state of the insect protein sector in Europe. We've spent the last decade building incredible technology. We have the best genetics, amazing operational and software practices, and the fanciest, almost cathedral-like facilities. But economically, Europe is struggling. High energy costs, high regulation based on an impossible to meet zero risk criteria, and massive capex have made scaling a slow and painful grind. You can watch my previous video called Is Insect Farming Over if you want details about the scaling issues and factory shutdowns that have occurred in Europe and are continuing to occur. Meanwhile, while we've been trying to make the economics work, China has in many ways, though with caveats, just gone ahead and done it. Now, they haven't been focused on glossy marketing campaigns or LinkedIn thought leadership, so you won't have heard probably any of it, even if you're within the insect industry. But what they have been doing is focusing on volume, strict cost reduction, and have never stopped innovating on core technological development. I believe they've built a sector that is operating at a scale now that is starting to eclipse the West in terms of actual output, not stated capacities, producing protein at a price point of 50% or less than those produced in Europe. It's a story of a completely different strategic approach, one that we need to talk about. Today, we're going to look at the numbers that you haven't heard because they're not being published in English and also because there's a big firewall between the EU and China, which doesn't help. So following my recent attendance of the International Protein Industry Conference, IPIC in Beijing, I've done a lot of thinking, and today I want us to answer together, is the European approach fundamentally flawed? Is the Chinese one winning out and taking over? And what happens if Chinese efficiency meets Western standards? So that's what we're going to do. Let's dive in. As ever, if you enjoy this, please follow me, subscribe to the channel, and leave your comments on this topic down below. Details will be pinned there too. To get the real story, I couldn't rely on just the usual industry reports. I needed someone on the inside. I sat down with Ruilong Zheng. Ruilong is unique because he's seen both playbooks. He spent 5 years as a nutritionist at Protix, one of the European heavyweights, before returning to China to consult on their domestic industry. And he now runs Flylong, which is an independent consultancy that bridges these two worlds. His details are also in the description. So Ruilong walked me through the reality of the Chinese market, and frankly, the numbers, like I said before, are making the European sector look much smaller. Like a 20-ton per day facility, I'm talking waste here, can be headline news. It takes years of planning and millions in funding. In China, estimates that there are about 70 companies operating above that level right now. But the real volume isn't just in the big plants, it's also in the long tail there. So there's between, they reckon, 800 to 900 active BSF companies in China. But if you count some of the smaller, more informal setups, it could be well past 1,000. And that would definitely make it rival and exceed Europe, even on a per capita basis. And combined, they're processing roughly 1.2 million tons of organic waste annually. Also, that's the information that they provided. China is projecting 15 to 20% annual growth for the next 5 years. And the reason we don't hear about this is simple. They aren't marketing to us. They're too busy either fulfilling domestic orders or dominating the US whole-dried larvae markets. In the EU, it's estimated that there are probably maybe 150 serious insect farming companies that are sort of visible out there saying they're insect farming companies, of which maybe 50 are now left above 20 tons per day at this point. And there is not really that informal sector, but there are probably hundreds of smaller pilots and smaller scale things being pursued by private companies in waste management or animal livestock that aren't necessarily, counting to the insect farming total, but would be equivalent to, say, the informal sector in terms of the numbers aren't really that known. But so why is there such a gap, however you count it? Well, it comes down to the why. Europe started with alternative protein. We tried to enter the food chain from the top, aiming for premium pet food and eventually human food. That requires farmer grade standards, which means farmer grade costs. China started with a waste problem first. The industry there boomed around 2018 due to the African swine fever outbreak. So that was a real tailwind. The government needed a way to treat catering and food waste that couldn't be fed to pigs anymore. So that created a really big boom around 2018 for the industry. And a lot of the progress and speedy ramp up came off the back of that, with many cities now pursuing full insect waste management solutions, using earthworms for sewage treatment and sludge, and BSF for city food and catering waste.
There's a African swine fever happening in China, and all in a sudden the catering waste is not allowed to go to pigs anymore. You have all this city with 15 million people, and with all their garbage, you need to dump it somewhere. It's the moment when everybody starts to produce a lot of BSF. So basically, the starting point of China has been really very different. They just want to find a way to get rid of their waste.
This waste-first mentality changed the economics entirely. In Europe, we pay for feedstock. In China, originally the government paid you to take the waste. But here's where it gets interesting. That model that I'm talking about was so successful that it actually became hyper-competitive. And so now some of the companies in China are actually building into their business models that they will be able to pay 20 euros per ton to buy food waste, because the larvae production is now actually profitable enough to cover it. They're utilizing everything over there, so that's expired food, but also manures and brewery wastes, and even traditional medicine residues are allowed. They iterated on the feedstock problem, while Europe has been more or less paralyzed by a regulatory standstill. Nothing has been moved on substrates for a long time. And they did the same thing with their labor, by the way, in China. In the West, our high labor costs forced us into a corner. We had to automate everything or die. Whereas China was able to lean into its labor force, specifically the rural and elderly. With low social security pensions, it's about 20 euros a month in China, BSF farming actually became an interesting way to supplement income for the elderly. It's called the village model, and it uses low-tech pit farms and manual labor. It might not look futuristic, but it does produce larvae at a cost that is almost impossible to beat with a robot. So weirdly, it's the lack of social care provisions that enabled that model, which I thought was a very interesting point. And if countries find themselves with similar low labor costs, there's a lot to be learned from that pit method village model.
And they could produce stuff so cheap. They could produce like 1 ton of fresh larvae, let's say 2,000 yuan. Let's say that's around 250 pounds.
250 pounds fresh larvae per ton is the number. And that is worked out at about 1,000 pounds per ton of dried larvae when you factor in drying. So if you can get to that number, 1,000 pounds a ton, with the right scale and consistency, that's a number that aquaculture would buy insect protein all day and give you an almost infinite demand. Now we have to address the elephant in the room, quality. Europe's high costs aren't all for nothing. We have traceability and we have purity. In China, because they're processing post-consumer catering waste, the risk of contamination is real and it's always there. You're dealing with plastics, chopsticks, whatever, inconsistent inputs. This quality gap is why Chinese protein hasn't flooded Europe yet. It mostly stays domestic, feeding their massive aquaculture industry, along with many other markets for animals that we would consider exotic, but actually form a lot of normal human food consumption over there. Things like crabs, turtles, and bullfrogs, and so forth. They're foods we don't eat here in the West. But with 1.5 billion people, with these more varied diets, with amphibians and reptiles, that actually does require a decent amount of larvae to satisfy that demand in what to us seem like niche spaces. But here is the hard truth. The quality shield won't protect European companies forever. China is evolving. They're moving from pits to vertical systems, they're professionalizing, and when they decide to turn those 100,000 tons of capacity toward export grade standards, European producers, whatever they do, are still not going to be able to compete. They're not going to be able to win that price war, especially with the current cost structures. The Chinese sector also has massive structural tailwinds. The soy problem. China is desperate to reduce its reliance on especially US, but also Brazilian soy for national security reasons. The government is pushing insect protein as a strategic imperative, and the recent tariffs and trade war with the US has only put more winds in the sails of that way of thinking. Sensible regulation. They follow the science, but they don't let red tape strangle the industry. They've prioritized solving the waste problem and giving the industry room to breathe and develop something in order to now put the sensible limits in. In Europe, we prioritized the precautionary principle. We played it ultra safe, and as a result, we have a safe, high-tech, but expensive industry that is struggling to compete with fish meal prices. In other words, zero risk leads to zero industry, meaning zero jobs and zero green development. That is just how the cookie crumbles sometimes. China, on the other hand, played it fast. We might say fast and loose over here, but they played it fast and they were able to accept a small amount of risk in order to do that. And they have a functional scaling industry that they can now tighten up on if needs be. The other thing is, weirdly, because the marketing of the early players has been so effective in Europe, I think has had a chilling effect in Europe on technological innovation. And it's not by design, but let me explain. So large engineering companies build these 100 million euro factories with the first big players. And they make, that just makes new methods of production seem unwise to new actors. After all, how can some of the world's biggest engineering companies with fabulously bright engineering teams not have thought through all the ins and outs? And I'm not saying that they didn't think through a lot of the ins and outs, or that their ideas haven't stood the test of time or even been great. But I could see how that would frame and shape the innovation landscape and the mindset of new engineers entering this space. And I think that's actually been the case for my company Flybox too, to some extent. However, in China, they aren't really aware of any of this. So if you walk their factories, there are new takes on technology, from what look like crazy ideas to things that on the surface of it look poised to make all the technology developed in Europe just look redundant, frankly. And so it's not that we have a crystal ball and today myself or Ruilong can tell you which will work, but it's that the lack of massive market leaders with the great communications and PR has meant engineering teams working more from first principles and kind of information silos, and also looking at the machinery sets from the other industries that are commonly produced and manufactured in China, could be how those could be adapted to BSF. So it's the combination of the relentless focus on cost reduction and waste management with all these kind of technological tailwinds that I think have proved to yield a higher diversity of factory layouts and methods, which at this point in the industry probably trumps trying to pretend that there's a surefire way of doing this. So what is the lesson here in all of this? The lesson is that we cannot afford to be arrogant about European technology. Yes, the robots are shiny and they do the job. Yes, our data is clean. But if the unit economics don't work, then the business fails, and all of that doesn't matter. We need to stop ignoring the East and start learning from their cost structures and technologies, and look at partnerships and how we work together. At Flybox, we believe the winner in this space won't be the one with the most patents, but the one who can actually deliver protein at a price the market will pay. And I'm personally very excited about what I saw in China. The Chinese sector proves that insect farming can work somewhere at scale without support. It's not just a science project, it's a legit waste management industry that is fast becoming the pillar of their waste management industry. So Europe needs to wake up to this reality. We need to adapt our approach, lower our capex, and get real about the economics. Now, not everything is rosy in China. Absolutely not. I'm not trying to claim that at all. But we're all aware of the hype of the European industry. So I'm trying to give you some hype of what I saw in the Chinese industry. And maybe in between that is something that could work. I want to know what you think. Did Europe overregulate itself into a corner? Is our technology prematurely been stunted, or will our quality focus pay off in the long run? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one as we explore the future of insect farming around the world.